like. But we are lucky to have that. But I think if any institution that I've worked in, if you actually think about what it does that's so special, you can actually start to work ideas around that. One of the things that I know you've picked up earlier in some of your sections has been about telling your story. And I think this is really important, particularly in an environment where, say, the government can be quite hands-off. Certainly at national level, we don't have a cultural policy. Might be a good thing. So things are very much in the hands of institutions themselves to give really persuasive and inspiring stories about themselves. I think it's quite often we're really bad at blowing our own trumpet, or why shouldn't we? And the sort of stories that I think we've all got are around things like capital creation, both in terms of social capital, cultural capital, but also economic capital. One of the things that we worked on in Wales was to identify the financial output of the National Museum in terms of the wealth that it put back into Wales, also the added value in terms of tourism, heads on beds, people buying meals, all that sort of thing, and the additional number of full-time equivalent posts that were being, or jobs that were employed across Wales. And strangely enough, politicians understood the argument that actually if you cut us, you're cutting all this stuff as well. So whilst it didn't stop some cuts coming through, the level of cuts, certainly for the museum in Wales, were far less severe than some of our colleagues across the way. So I think understanding what your financial impact is very important, in addition to your educational, cultural, and social impact. And then communicating those really great stories to stakeholders, to government, to local authorities, or whatever, I think is fundamentally important to the future. We don't do enough of it. And I think if we are changing society and looking to do that, then we ought to be talking about it and the ways in which we're doing it. And then finally, and you'll notice Far Lap here, today is the Melbourne Cup, so I thought this would be entirely appropriate. I think one of the big challenges that we face in New Zealand, well, one of the big challenges is the fact that I'm here. And I've come from the UK. Why can't New Zealand source people to take over these institutions? And so I think building sustainable leadership for the future is very important. And we can't just pay, nodding attention to it. We do have to recognize that we have to have systems and processes that enable staff in institutions in New Zealand to be able to step up, to get the experience, to get the decision-making and expertise that's needed. So this sort of X factor, if you like, how do we develop the leaders of the future? How do we develop talented people within the whole of the cultural sector? It's not just a museum thing. It's how you develop that in that sector, and how you provide your employees with active learning experiences. I think any employer should actually be doing that, but I think there's an even bigger, longer-term driver behind this. And again, how can we just be the best? How do we become the preferred employer of choice for talented people? So it's a long-term thing, it's a generational thing, but it is about changing and transformation. So those are 12 questions that we've been asking ourselves. I hope not all of them seem irrelevant to you, that they actually do have a certain resonance. So what I'd like to finish with, actually what I might do, anybody take a guess at what that item is? Very close. You can get a job at Te Papa. Very close. It was actually a piece of rubbish that I picked up. Now hopefully this is going to start. Yes, it is. There we go. There's a little clue for you. And funnily enough, it goes back to what Aparani was talking about earlier, about the First World War. Okay? Any more guesses? It was just a piece of leather. It's actually the heel from a boot. Now, a curator would describe it as boot, British Army, 1914 pattern. Okay? So that's very precise. So what I wanted to do was just give you a little bit of context, because this is the Somme battlefield. The photograph was taken on the 12th of July, 1916. It's almost certain that that boot was there. And this is a place called Mametz Wood. And it's where the Welsh division went in to attack. And it was a particularly bloody battle. Quite a number of the soldiers inevitably were killed. And this is a painting by Christopher Williams called The Welsh at Mametz Wood. So what we're starting to do is to build a picture. We've gone from a piece of random rubbish to what was clearly a British Army boot. It was found at this place, Mametz Wood. So, where I found it, I haven't got a pointer, it was just sort of in that field, just sitting there. But what I want to do is just very quickly, I won't read all of this because I'm running out of time. This is from a sound recording that was made in 1980, so it's a little bit sort of random. But it was made by Sergeant Tom Price from the 2nd Rhondda Battalion. And he says, "We saw those men going in like a line, and the line disappearing where the men were going down. And we could see there was a line just withering away, and we realized then what was happening. That was the first indication we had of attacking warfare, because we were watching those fellows being cut down like corn. And as soon as the boys got out of a bit of a hollow where they were protected, as soon as they got level there and their heads came up, these machine guns were opening fire and wiping them down." Now, he's talking about a hollow, and the hollow is actually just behind what is probably one of the most garish First World War memorials you'll see anywhere. But it is just sort of, if you imagine literally, we're standing here, this is the hollow, they came up and then they dropped down. The German machine guns were in those, effectively those bushes. It's called the hammerhead position. And the troops were marching across the field and being taken in flank by these machine guns. So that's a little bit of context. So clearly what happened was that whoever was wearing that boot didn't make it, almost certainly killed on that particular day at the same time as that sort of description. So what we're starting to do is to build a little bit of context, a little bit of story. But also what we can do, we can get the facts, and that's a personal experience. You can get the official history description of the same action. You can get the divisional histories, all that sort of thing. Beautiful descriptions to a greater or lesser extent. But what you've been able to do, or some of you, is actually been able to touch that thing, and you've been touching history. And what you can then start to do is to engender a little bit of thought about, well, who wore that? What were they like? What happened after the war, say, to that individual's family, if he had a family? How did they cope with the difficulties of the 1920s? And there are some wonderful, well, not wonderful, very harrowing descriptions in the archive in Wales, which talked about families going into workhouses because the breadwinner had been killed in the war. So there's that sort of impact. First World War, some of you may start to generate personal stories about family who may have been involved in the war, all the rest of it. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that what libraries and museums actually do is unlock the obscure. They can give meaning, they can give content, they can create emotional reaction, they can provide knowledge, very important. But basically, you're unlocking a world, and a world of transformational information, a world of change. And you may want to go out of here and sort of find out a bit more about the Battle of Mametz, or about what happened to the New Zealand division at the Battle of Passchendaele or something. But this is what we do, and I think at the core of everything that we do, we should never really lose contact with that ability to transform knowledge and information and provide context, because that's what people want. So thank you very much. And can I have my piece of rubbish back at the end, please?
Well, thank you very very much indeed, Michael, for that fascinating presentation. We do have time for 1 or 2 questions, if anyone would like to ask Michael anything. Any questions or observations?
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think there are some sort of environmental issues that would probably look to move us more towards those sorts of situations. And I think there are some very good examples of that, not too far away, you know, like up in New Plymouth, which are really great examples of how libraries and museums can work together. And there is quite a holistic sense around it. I think where you've got a really strong sense of community, a strong sense of what's important around knowledge, what's important around the treasures within a community. And I really, I mean, one of the things I didn't really get into it here was the whole question of memory, and particularly community memory, which I think is driving a lot of what we see in certainly museums, and libraries in a sense I think are already there. So there's a sort of intellectual synergy, but I think there will be a more sort of economic synergy as well, which is around the use of the space. And we're seeing more and more these days about how different types of institutions can make connections in order to keep costs down, you know, keep your utilities down, you know, amalgamate services, all that sort of thing. So I think there will be quite a number of drivers around that. Particularly, I think, at a sort of local and community level. I don't think it's necessarily, you know, I actually think it's a pretty good thing. And I think maybe what we haven't been able to do is to explore a lot of the sort of potential that exists around that, and certainly particularly through digital technologies and so on, to be able to do that sort of thing. But I think seeing libraries and museums as community spaces, I think, is fundamentally important. And I think then, with that sort of synergy, what you can really start to explore are things like generating local debate around contemporary issues, you know, that forum idea, which is sometimes a little bit difficult for individuals to do, but where you've got that sort of slightly larger block, if you like, of a museum, a library, stroke archive, record service or whatever, then I think you can start to generate some of these really sort of quite challenging aspects of work.
One last question from over here.
I think that's one of the big challenges, and we've got it at the moment with Te Huki Tūranga. And clearly it should be with the community, but equally it is a national treasure as well, and so there are responsibilities around the preservation of that. And I think certainly the iwi are very cognizant of that, and so we're jointly taking a long-term view of how that's achieved. And so I think in some senses, it's a little bit like a loan anyway to another museum, providing they can, you know, our responsibility is around the care and ensuring that it's preserved for the future and actually preserved for that community. So I think the challenge to the museum is not just about us saying, well, here's the rules, you sort it out. It's about actually how we can get our teams involved in terms of advice and ongoing, literally curatorial responsibility around those sorts of sites. I don't think it's impossible to do it. I think there are some small steps we can take. Yes, we've already got lots of loans out there in a variety of different settings. But I think there is an opportunity for us to more formally start to share our collections. And one of the things I think we want to do is to enable communities to use the national collection to tell local stories, rather than us being colonial about it and saying, well, here we are, we've got an exhibition for you, would you like it? And so that other scenario is more complex, particularly around the whole sort of care and preservation thing. Obviously, we would know that eventually the objects would come back into the collections as exhibitions changed. I think the really big challenge, though, is about more permanent arrangements where we're putting the collections out into the communities. And at the end of the day, it's going to be about resources and how those resources are marshalled. But I think what's interesting about it is that it does break down this concept of the mothership, which is Te Papa, with all its sitting on its collections, and just getting those collections out there to where they are the lifeblood of the community. I think that's so fundamentally important, particularly in a smaller nation. Yeah.
Oh, well, Sue, one final question.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Well, Michael, clearly you've given us a very stimulating start to the day. I'd like you to show your appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Fantastic.
Just a few notes before morning tea. Could session chairs please call into registration desk to collect certificates before their sessions? We now have morning tea sponsored by AbNote, then concurrent sessions. Morning tea goes from 10 o'clock to 10:45. Concurrent sessions start at 10:45, and at 11:30, could we be back here for Keynote 6, Karen Coyle? Thank you very much.